Sorry, moment of panic. Who has the slides? But no, we have them. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm Arianna Tassinari from the University of Bologna, and together with other colleagues in the partner, I was leading the comparative analysis of collective bargaining developments during the inflation crisis. And what I'm going to be presenting just now, it's a very necessarily simplified overview, okay, of the very rich findings that came from our cross-country analysis that covered 5 countries and 3 sectors within each country, okay? So for the interest of time, I'm gonna, kind of just give the very, very rough overview. And then in our roundtable discussion, where we will have contributions from representatives of all the 5 countries, we can go into further depth also in specific, obviously, like sectoral developments and so on, right? So the guiding questions of our, of our analysis in this in this part of the project, as Oscar was already anticipating, was essentially asking, what did the inflation crisis of, 22-23 reveal about the resilience, or also like the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities of collective bargaining systems, but also, what is very important for us, what has been very important throughout this project, is to try, obviously, to draw some lessons from this very tough conjuncture, right, that can help to inform collective bargaining strategy going forward to face also future inflationary shocks that are obviously, as Oscar but also Carlos earlier this morning reminding us, kind of a new normal, right, and not something that is so isolated. And so we had 5 countries covered in the project that represent very different institutional configurations of collective bargaining and of how collective bargaining is, supported in different ways by the state. And, I'm not going to be able to give in depth here an overview of the institutional setup of these countries, which would require a lot more time than we have. But, the main one of the main dimensions of distinctions, obviously, is the level and degree of coordination in collective bargaining, and to what extent is this supported by the state, or is founded on kind of like bargaining autonomy of collective bargaining partners, right? And so we have, obviously, Denmark represents a classic case of coordinated bargaining that is based on partners' bargaining autonomy. Okay, so there is no formalized role of the state in supporting bargaining coordination, but there is a very strong and institutionalized dynamic of pattern bargaining. This means that usually the manufacturing sector leads the bargaining round and sets the kind of wage norms that are then translated through to the other sectors, including the public sector to some extent, right? So negotiation, autonomous negotiation of the social partners is the main mechanism of adjustment. So there is no automatic indexation mechanisms. There's also no statutory minimum wages that therefore there is no dynamic of state-led wage setting that influences the collective bargaining autonomy, right? So in a sense, it's like the ideal type of the kind of like autonomous collective bargaining, strong social partners autonomy. Spain is a different case in the sense that Spain has, a strong kind of institutionalized coordinated adjustment that is based on interconfederal agreements negotiated at the national level, which have been supported through different times in history, more or less by the state, right? And this kind of like cross-sector coordination, to some extent, supports the sectoral dimension in important ways. Obviously, we know that coverage and coordination in the Spanish case were weakened during in the aftermath of the Eurozone crisis through the various interventions that sought to some extent decentralize collective bargaining agreement, but in recent years also thanks to the policy interventions of the coalition government that already Carlos talked to us about this morning, has been to some extent revived. But there is a greater role for the state in indirectly supporting this coordination dynamic. So in that sense, it's different from the Danish case, where autonomy to some extent is complete, right? And then we have the German case, which is also a case of strong collective bargaining autonomy, but with a, coverage that, as we know, has been partly challenged, especially in some sectors, in services, and it represents a pattern whereby the dynamic of negotiated adjustment came partly through the autonomous sphere of collective bargaining, but was actually more than in the past supported by the state, especially through the fiscal channel and through, kind of like tax-free inflation bonuses that were given as part of the, inflation management outside of the negotiated wage settlements, okay? So that supported real incomes, but without going to, sort of like permanently impact on the negotiated wage scales, right? And this is to some extent in line with the historic German concern of, keeping keeping an attention to wage price spirals and to, to some extent, in kind of like maintaining a logic of wage moderation to some extent. But it's also important to say that there are wage pushes that are coming very strongly also from especially segments of the service sector, of the public sector, right? And so there is the dynamic of intersectoral coordination is subject to new dynamics in which it's not so clear anymore, right, that manufacturing represents like the dominant pattern setter, and there is also kind of like renewed wage pushes that come from other parts of the economy. Italy represents in our sample of countries a country that has very high formal coverage of collective bargaining and almost total predominance of sectoral collective bargaining as the main locus of bargaining, relatively limited development of firm-level collective bargaining, limited mostly to certain sectors and large firms. But it's a system that has shown, especially in the recent conjuncture, but not for the first time, some strong institutional weaknesses in terms of very long delays, often in the time that it takes to renew collective bargaining agreements, so accumulated delays that obviously reflect in accumulated wage losses over time, and in a deeply unequal capacity across sectors to recuperate inflation. Some sectors, thanks to power resources, kind of like stronger bargaining dynamic, are able to kind of like recuperate inflation much more, and there isn't really any institutionalized mechanism that allows for gains in one sector to kind of be reflected in other sectors, say through a pattern bargaining dynamic, right? There is no also formalized wage indexation mechanisms, with the exception of the metalworking sectoral collective bargaining that I will talk about in a minute. And so this has actually made Italy, let's say, case of deep real wage erosion in the context of the inflation crisis, despite high sectoral coverage. And this, it's interesting because it tells us something about, how formal coverage in itself doesn't always tell us the whole part of the story. And then obviously Poland represents a case where, as we know, collective bargaining coverage is extremely low, only limited in certain small segments of the economy, and so the lion's share of the work in terms of wage adjustment is done by minimum wage setting. So the state here has a much stronger role in terms of determining wage dynamics, and is overall kind of like much more important than collective bargaining in setting the wage floor and setting the dynamic of of wage growth. So given this institutional diversity, obviously finding common patterns, it's almost almost impossible, right? But that was not really the point, right? What we kind of wanted to highlight is that obviously across the European landscape, given institutional diversity, policy responses in collective bargaining are necessarily variegated, but there are nonetheless some obviously like overarching findings that emerge, and I'm going to run you through the main four that come out of our comparative analysis. The first one, obviously, again, is kind of like almost self-evident, but like coordination matters a lot, and we find that in those settings where there were stronger mechanisms of coordination across sectors and across levels, but mostly across sectors. Collective bargaining was able to better adapt to inflationary pressures and to some extent to, maybe extend the collective bargaining strength in certain sectors also to pull along the wage dynamic, perhaps in weaker sectors, right? And this can happen, I mean, the research highlights that this can happen through very different means. You can have a kind of Danish path to coordination, which is fully founded on kind of like a long-standing norm of pattern bargaining that is fully reliant on autonomous capacities of collective bargaining partners. You can have a more kind of like indirectly state-supported interconfederal dynamic of coordination, for instance, in Spain through the interconfederal agreements, of which there is a history, but still there is always to some extent a political dynamic underpinning it. The two countries where we observe weak coordination, which are obviously Italy, but also Poland to some extent, are those where we find, the kind of like bigger difficulties in kind of like adapting across the board the responsive capacity of collective bargaining to the inflationary pressures. So coordination matters. Obviously, we know that the legacies of liberalization of industrial relations over the last 30 years has eroded exactly this coordination capacity that matters a lot for dealing with inflationary challenges. And so this is obviously the first challenge for, the politics, the public policy support towards collective bargaining is like, how can coordination be renewed? The collective bargaining directive, to some extent, tries to address this issue, but the ways to do this in different national settings will necessarily vary. The second cross-cutting finding is that in none of the countries that we have examined, there has been a return to automatic indexation. We haven't found, any cases where this has been put back on the agenda in a kind of like generalized way. What, however, is interesting is that in some cases there have been conditional partial revision clauses that have been reintegrated in some sectoral collective bargaining agreement, both in Spain, but also in Italy, and I will talk about this a little more in a second. And these have actually performed very well where they were present in terms of protecting the wage dynamic, right? Which I think for us signals that even though for various reasons talking about it, automatic indexation continues to be, in many contexts, perceived almost as a taboo, right? Or like a vestige of the 70s that we will never return to. In those sectoral contexts where automatic or semi-automatic safeguard indexation clauses are present, obviously the outcomes in terms of wage dynamic and labor-friendly inflationary management are better. And so this puts the question of like, perhaps we should, reflect a little bit more about maybe different or like more circumscribed institutionalized mechanisms of indexation that allow for an adjustment of real incomes to inflationary pressures, because as already Carlos this morning was saying, often the standard time period of collective bargaining tends to be too slow to react to the very often fast inflationary shocks that can, cascade through the economy, especially as a result of energy shocks, right? And so if collective bargaining moves a little bit slowly, automatic indexation clauses can kind of like jump in and act as a sort of automatic stabilizer that can make a really big difference in terms of kind of managing the welfare losses, again, that Carlos was evoking this morning, right? The third point is that the aspect of the distributive dynamic of collective bargaining was just as central in terms of like shaping, the internal politics of collective bargaining rounds as compensation across the board. What do we mean by distributive dynamic? Is that, as we know, as already Carlos illustrated earlier, inflation does not hit equally across the income distribution, right? It often hits low-income families, low-income workers harder due to higher propensity to consume and so on, the various dynamics we know. And so what matters when we look at the capacity of collective bargaining to recuperate inflation in wage bargaining is not only the average wage settlement, but also what groups are protected, and are low wage groups that are disproportionately affected by inflation protected or compensated more strongly. And this distributive concern for low wage groups was very predominant in the Danish case, where low wage groups generally received like higher minimum wage rates, alongside obviously kind of like centrally negotiated income elements for the whole of the wage distribution. And in Spain, this varied by sector, but here we have an interaction with the minimum wage, which obviously tends to push up the wage, the wage scale, especially at the lower end of the distribution. And this was particularly visible in a relatively low wage sector like retail. Germany, the dynamic of favoring low wage groups was a present concern, especially for the service sector wage agreements, but the one of compensation were generally targeted kind of like across the board rather than specifically to low wage groups. And but so it's kind of like an ongoing conversation within the German system about how can this distributed dynamic better be managed. And in Italy and Poland, generally speaking, the weaker dynamic of coordination, and also in the Italian case, the complete absence, again, of a statutory minimum wage left low-paid groups actually particularly exposed to inflationary erosion. This was compensated in Poland through the minimum wage rises, but it did not fully compensate for the inflationary shock. And then the last point that is also relevant if we think about the interaction, right, between public policy and collective bargaining is the role of the state. As Oscar already saying, in general, we see in this wave of inflation, compared to like kind of classic inflation of the 70s or classic concerns of the incomes policy debates, of the 80s and 90s, kind of like a greater renewed role of the state in managing and in supporting collective bargaining, in addressing inflationary pressures, but the role of the state can be very different depending on context, and it can either support, offer a legal scaffolding for collective bargaining, it can complement through different channels, for instance, through fiscal support that to some extent complements without substituting the collective bargaining dynamic, but it can also, to some extent, slightly contribute to undermining collective bargaining, okay? And this is a complicated point, but for instance, we see that the thrust of state intervention in the Italian case has been one of, trying to, for instance, offer tax and fiscal relief to workers rather than trying to directly support collective bargaining, and this has meant that, to some extent, it has contributed, at least in some cases, to kind of like normalizing a fairly weak collective bargaining dynamic, okay, by raising real incomes without forcing employers to pay for it, but shifting the burden onto, the fiscalità generale, the general taxation, right? And so this is an issue potentially, because it might weaken collective bargaining dynamics in the long run. And finally, in Poland, it's a case where obviously, the state plays the dominant role through the minimum wage setting system, and this does not, despite obviously having a very important role in supporting real incomes, does not support collective bargaining architecture in any way, right? So the state can play very many different roles, and asking ourselves what kind of dynamic of state support, state interaction with collective bargaining is more conducive to labor-friendly outcomes is obviously a very important question. And again, the evidence shows that there are different avenues, very different pathways possible towards similar outcomes. Finally, I just want to draw our attention towards a few interesting sectoral innovations that emerged from our research that are perhaps worth discussing, and maybe our social partners and colleagues in, from across the partner countries in the roundtable discussion can return on these and maybe explain them a little bit more. Sectoral innovations means, practices that we found in specific sectors across the countries that seem to, perform in particularly, interesting ways, right, in supporting the collective bargaining dynamic. So one is in Denmark, the so-called free choice account, which is essentially, Christian will be able to explain it better, but it's like a pot in which employers contribute, I think, up to 11% of contributions, and that workers can draw on either for additional holidays, for additional annual leave, or for various kind of, welfare in some cases, that acts essentially as a compensatory income support instrument, right, that goes alongside negotiated wage adjustments, and it's negotiated centrally rather than locally. And so it kind of helps to re-centralize part of wage protection, especially for workers that have maybe weaker bargaining power at the local, firm level. And so it is a way in which, the outside of just negotiating the wage scale, the Danish collective bargaining system managed to some extent support real incomes overall. We then have the Spanish case, which, we find two interesting innovations there. On the one hand, the presence of reintroduction of wage safeguard clauses in the construction sector, which is, not full, not total, and also partly subject to delays in terms of the real wage dynamics. So it's like not a perfect tool, but nonetheless, it's a deviation from the previous complete absence, complete marginalization of wage safeguard clauses that will be interesting to see to what extent it becomes institutionalized, possibly extended, and so on. Another case where we find the activation of safeguard clauses is actually Italy in the metalworking sector, that also our colleague Simone from CGL will talk to us more about it during the roundtable. But it's essentially a very rare exception in the Italian collective bargaining system. It actually was in place since before the onset of the inflation crisis, and it was reactivated, obviously, in the context of the inflationary shock. It updates ex post minima, contractually agreed minima based on realized inflation rather than forecast inflation. And so it represented a very, very important mechanism of adjustment of real wages to inflation, kind of like on top of what was then realized through the standard round of collective bargaining agreement, right? So far it remains an exception, kind of like a self-standing exception, but it might be interesting to reflect maybe to what extent the positive experience of having the safeguard clause in place in the metalworking sector could act as an example for other sectors too. The problem is that it's always a question of power resources. It exists there because of specific power configurations in the metalworking sector that are not easy to replicate elsewhere, right? And so the question is like, in sectors where you have kind of weaker collective labor power resources, then what could be ways to achieve similar institutional innovation? And then finally, the German case, the main institutional innovation in a sense was this kind of like one-off inflation compensation premia that were kind of like outside of standard negotiated wage scales, but that played a very important role, obviously, in supporting real incomes. And these show both the appeal in terms of like the speed and the responsive capacity of a kind of more like fiscal, like tax reliant way of supporting real incomes. But obviously the question is like, what does that do to the broader wage dynamic, right? So there are obviously different ways of addressing inflationary shocks and of achieving also an interaction that can be more or less virtuous between the fiscal tax policy and collective bargaining dynamics. And it will be interesting also to hear from our partners in the roundtable what is the current way of thinking with regard to the current inflationary shocks, right? In terms of like what instruments, what kind of instruments are desirable, what kind of instruments are sufficient, should we replicate the response that we saw in 2021, 2022, or think differently with other instruments for the current inflationary push. So just to conclude, basically the three main lessons that we draw from the last inflation crisis is that obviously coordination capacity matters more than just formal coverage. Okay, having formal coverage is helpful, but what is also important is the most resilient systems are those where, to some extent, across sectors we can have coordination dynamics that bring the weaker sectors along, okay, with the recuperation of purchasing power. Second lesson is that to some extent, sometimes the normal time frame of collective bargaining alone can be too slow, especially if inflationary shocks are really fast, and that is why either indexation clauses or fiscal interventions that intervene kind of like outside of the standard temporal time frame of collective bargaining can be helpful to protect real incomes in real time. And then finally, the locus, the trajectory of state action, if we are concerned with preserving the coordination capacity of collective bargaining, should be that of reinforcing rather than replacing or displacing collective bargaining. And this, maybe in this arena, is a kind of like commonplace thing to point out, but the danger of kind of like substituting through, for instance, the fiscal or the statutory minimum wage channel for collective bargaining dynamic is always a real risk. So just to conclude, essentially, the main open questions that we would kind of like ask to our colleagues in the round table is essentially, what should and what do we learn, what can collective bargaining do, and what can it do alone, right, in the context of repeated inflationary shocks, and can we leave the whole burden to collective bargaining, or do we need to think in kind of more expansive ways about the interaction, right, between collective bargaining and the fiscal side? It is obviously also a question that will be relevant for the next panel that will reflect more on public policy and what kind of instruments, what kind of institutional innovations, which can look very different across institutional setting, seem to be most promising and to address the kind of new normal that seems to be, right, of frequent inflationary shocks, and what lessons obviously can we draw from across different contexts. So I'm gonna end here, and I'm gonna now open up the floor to our collective bargaining and research partners. I think rather than just taking questions directly, I would sort of maybe move into the responses from the representatives of the different countries, and then we can have a general round of Q&A at the end, because I think the partners from the different countries can expand on things that I already mentioned just as a kind of like overview in my own presentation. So I would do it in that way, if that's okay with everyone, rather than having two Q&A, if you know what I mean.
No, that makes